All right, Lieutenant Fotskar, do you want to begin?
Sure thing, I can go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this community notification meeting. And I'd like to thank the presenters that have agreed to help us out with this meeting. I'll introduce them shortly. My name is Tom Fotskar. I'm a lieutenant with the Rochester Police Department. I supervise our investigation units, and part of my duties include being an administrator for our predatory offender program. And that's the purpose for our meeting today. We are holding this meeting to share information with you regarding a predatory offender who moved to Rochester last week on Friday the 26th. The state of Minnesota does require that we follow certain guidelines, including what information is shared and how it can be shared. I'll go ahead and I'll introduce our presenters today. We have Brad Vandervet from the Department of Corrections. He's the notification coordinator for the Department of Corrections. Nancy Johnston is the director of Minnesota Sex Offender Program. And Mark Ostrom is here, the Olmsted County Attorney. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to note that the meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Rochester Police Department's YouTube channel for viewing later. Also, as you can see at the bottom of the slide that just popped up, during the presentation, I will be monitoring my email. If you have any questions for any of the presenters or for myself, please send me an email. I will get those to the presenters, and we will try and do a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Also, if you're watching the recorded version of this, feel free to send me an email, and we will follow up with your questions in regard to this. With that, I think I will toss it over to Brad to start the presentation.
Fantastic. Sorry.
Brad, I apologize. I can cover the overall agenda quick. The presenters will discuss with you and explain the registration process and the risk levels for offenders. They'll discuss the Community Notification Act and the Minnesota Sex Offender Program. We will talk about the offender that moved to Rochester on Friday the 26th, Benjamin Ellerson. And there will be a list of resources that you can contact. And if you have any questions, like I said, feel free to email me during the presentation. With that, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Awesome. All right. And thank you, Lieutenant. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to either attend this live presentation this afternoon or who may be accessing this later on as a recorded version. I really do appreciate you taking the time to review this important information on this topic. As Lieutenant said, my name is Brad Vandervet with the Minnesota Department of Corrections, and I'm here just to assist by providing some foundational information as we get started to really ensure that this conversation has at its basic a common understanding of all the different various parts within the broader state risk management system that we'll be talking about throughout today's presentation. And I find with conversations like this really where the best place to begin is kind of with what we all know as community members, as neighbors, and that is that those individuals that engage in this type of harm and conduct, sexual harm, they exist. And we understand that. And we know that they're not new to communities. They're most certainly not new to law enforcement. And it's likely, given that they are in existence and around, that they are within or traveling through or frequenting every community, not only just within the state of Minnesota, but beyond. And so really the question then comes down to, well, what then are we doing as local police departments, county sheriff's departments, attorneys' offices, and other state agencies to address those who we become aware of through the system, those who have been essentially brought in through the criminal justice system or through treatment programs and so on, to address those unique issues of this population. And so we could just move to the next slide. One of the first components of that larger system that came online was the registry. And this is really a pillar of that risk management system that the state utilizes. As you can see, the registry came online in the early 90s, as most these laws did, and was really born out of the advocacy of the Jacob Wetterling family following the abduction of Jacob. And they really went out, and they and then other advocacy groups and agencies after them went to law enforcement and really asked, what more can we do to assist you in the important work of managing and monitoring this population of folks? And law enforcement really said resoundingly, what we need is a tool that collates all of our data into a system that's easily accessible to all agencies. Prior to the registry, the information collected and retained would have been maintained in-house or siloed within each individual agency that dealt with these individuals, and would be shared only after the fact should something else occur. Now, with the registry, we're able to allow law enforcement to move in real time and to see what's going on in and around their areas of operation, their jurisdictions, and beyond. And it's proven to be a very valuable tool in the policing toolbox. So the registry is maintained by the state's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and by law is set as private information. All of the data that the registry collects and maintains on those subject to it is considered by law private data, and therefore is used for law enforcement and correctional purposes only. Information that they collect and maintain on those required to register are things like their primary address, any secondary addresses, places they may frequent. Think things like loved ones' homes, family members' homes, if they're going there with some frequency, significant others' homes, or rental properties or vacation properties or something like that. They must make those addresses known to law enforcement as well. In addition to their primary and secondary addresses, law enforcement must also be made aware of a registrant's employment. That's all employment. So, and especially if they're operating a motor vehicle for that employer, that information must also be made known to law enforcement. Other components of the registry include notification on any schools that they're enrolled in or may be attending, and vehicles that they themselves either use, own, or possess, even to the point of the old car that's got expired tabs on the side of the driveway must be known to law enforcement as well. Other components of the registry are rental units such as storage units must be known to law enforcement, and phone numbers and so on. And so you can see the robustness of the registry for those law enforcement policing purposes. Should the need arise where law enforcement has to quickly narrow down a list of people to look to if something were to come up, they can search by make, model, year of vehicles, partial license plates, descriptions, physical descriptions, tattoos, any other identifying things, and narrow their search much more quickly and effectively get support and assistance out to where it's most needed when it's most needed. Next slide, please. And so with the registry, like I said, most of that information is for law enforcement purposes predominantly. But for meetings like this, I'm able to take kind of a 30,000-foot flyover view to really share with you kind of what's going on in and around not only your community, but throughout portions of the state as well. And to begin with this information, I want to put in your mind the analogy of a funnel. And at the broadest end of that funnel is those incidences that occur, those sexual harm incidences throughout not only the state, but beyond. And what we know from our data and research that's been done throughout the time since we started researching this topic is that the majority of those offenses that occur do not go on to get reported to law enforcement. And that funnel begins to narrow. Of those that do get reported to law enforcement, we know that only a percentage of those may result in going forward with formal charges. And the funnel narrows further. Of those charged, we know that only a percentage of those may go on to receive convictions for their crimes. And of those convicted, only a portion of that group may go on to cross the threshold of either MSOP or a prison system. And that can be any prison, whether it's within the state of Minnesota, any other state in the union, to include US territories, or military or other federal prisons. And I'll tell you why, as we go through this, why that distinction is important to understand. And so we see that funnel continuing to narrow as we get down to that group that we're able to talk about. So to my numbers here on our slide, you will see that as of the first of this year, there were approximately 18,727 registered individuals on the BCA's registry system. That's all individuals from no risk level assigned to those with levels 1 through 3. And as of the 11th of February, when I last ran these numbers, you can see in and around your area and your community, they were at that moment. And again, bear in mind, these numbers are dynamic and they do fluctuate and change as these individuals do move with some frequency. But at this time, there were 399 registrants reporting a primary residence within Olmsted County. At that time, 347 of that 399 were reporting addresses within the Rochester zip code area. You can see neighboring communities as we go down the line. The point I really like to make here with this information is that there is no community within the state of Minnesota that does not have registered individuals within its borders. And remembering that these numbers are not level 3 individuals. This is all registered individuals. Again, those with no level assigned and those 1 through 3 individuals. Next slide, please. So the next question that often comes up with the registry is who then is required to go onto it? How does that work? And really the registry has kind of grown and adapted throughout the years from its early inception in the 90s to today. Initially, it was comprised of those who'd been either charged with or convicted of sex-specific crimes or crimes of sexual nature against children. But then the state really saw the benefit of this tool for law enforcement and policing purposes and grew the registry to include additional types of crimes that were non-sex specific, such as kidnapping and false imprisonment. And so this is why some of you may recall the name change from the sex offender registry to the predatory offender registry. And a simple way to keep it straight as we go forward today and get into some of the details of all this information in your mind is that while all sex offenders are predatory offenders, not all predatory offenders are sex offenders. So just use that as kind of a way to kind of keep it straight. Next slide, please. So the next component or the next pillar that came online with that broader state management system that we've been talking about really was the Community Notification Act. And this came online in the mid to late 90s and is founded on, it's a response to the Megan's Act or Megan's Law from the national side. And really in Minnesota is a response to the broad research study that we conducted in the Department of Corrections that showed that a well-informed community is in fact a safer community. And so because community notification is the reason we're here today to be able to share this information with you, it's worth going into a little bit more detail as to how that process works more broadly. And so the way it works, it's really broken into two distinct roles. There are the notification side. So when an individual crosses that threshold of prison, that narrowest end of that funnel, remember, then they are subject to the end of confinement review process, or the ECRC. And the end of confinement review committee exists in all state prisons, one in central office and one at the Department of Human Services Minnesota Sex Offender Program for those civilly committed individuals, as they are also subject, as you'll learn today, to that risk assessment process. And so the way that process goes is that the individual, once they cross that threshold, whether it's through MSOP or the DOC side, will then go through a robust review from the End of Confinement Review Committee, and they will compile all the data available on that subject. And an assessor will ultimately interview them, and run that information through a risk assessment tool born out of the study that I'll be referencing here in a little bit. That risk assessment tool is known as the MinSOST, or the Minnesota Sex Offender Screening Tool, and is informed by that research study where the initial part of the study covered over 3,166 known sex offenders who were entering the community from the early 90s when the study began all the way through into the early 2000s when the initial study concluded. So over a decade's time, following thousands of men into the community and marking their successes and their failures. And ultimately being brought into through the rigors of the scientific review process to create a validated and normed risk assessment tool. So today, when we speak to you about risk levels 1, 2, or 3, know that we are speaking specifically to that peer group from that study. So when I say an individual has a score of, or a lower score, and is a level 1 individual, that is saying that they have a lower amount of those known predictive risk factors as compared to their peer group from that study. A level 2 has a moderate amount, and a level 3 has a higher amount. The one thing to really keep in mind when it comes to these risk assessment tools is that while they are a great resource for law enforcement and corrections to operate with in their planning to mitigate and address those risk factors identified, the one thing they cannot do is predict the future. And another thing to really keep in mind is that risk is dynamic. Risk levels can and do change as the individual progresses through programming. And you will actually see that in this man's chronology today, how those risk levels are dynamic. But the thing to keep in mind is that when once a 3, not always a 3, and vice versa, once a 1 doesn't mean that they can't find themselves potentially falling out of compliance with those known tools that mitigate that risk and having their level go up. So just keep that in mind as we go forward today. Next slide, please. So once that risk level has been assessed and assigned, the handoff then goes to law enforcement to provide notification to the community within the scope of that level. And so for a risk level 1 individual, law enforcement will provide notification to other law enforcement agencies, the victim of or witnesses to the offense, if they've requested that special level of enhanced notification, and other immediate adult household members residing in the home with that registrant. And that is the scope of a level 1 notification. Next slide, please. Now, with a level 2 notification, we build on those individuals and entities I just covered with a level 1 and include other individuals or entities that law enforcement determines to be at particular risk based on that registrant's known pattern of criminal conduct. Now, it's often believed with a level 2 that that means law enforcement will provide notification to schools, daycares, churches, and things of that nature. Now, while that may be true, that is not always the case. And so in a scenario with a level 2 registrant, should law enforcement be made aware or see that this individual is coming into their community and they review the dossier of information provided to them by either MSOP or the Department of Corrections, and they conclude that this individual focuses their conduct and behavior against let's say adult females at bars or social gatherings like concert venues or things of that nature. In that scenario, law enforcement may conclude that it's not prudent to notify the daycare because they serve children ages infant to school age. It's more prudent to notify the proprietors of the organizations that like the bars or the concert venues to inform them of this individual so that they can educate their security staff or whomever to keep an eye out should this individual be seen in or around the areas. Now, on the flip side with a level 2, if you have somebody on the other side of the spectrum, say a level 2 that comes into the community and law enforcement determines through their review of that information that this individual focuses their conduct and behavior on unaccompanied minors, say children in transit from school to after school programs or home, and law enforcement knows that in their community there's a particular hangout or hotspot where teens like to congregate and socialize in those down times. In that scenario, law enforcement may very well go to the proprietor of that location, that teen hangout spot, and inform them of the individual and say, look, if you see this individual around, let us know. We'd like to come out and talk with them and find out more about what they may be up to in the area. And so that's the nuance of a level 2 notification. And then on to a level 3 notification, which is what we're here essentially focusing on today, even though the man you're here to learn about today is not assigned a risk level 3. But with a level 3 notification, it triggers broad public notification. And that comes in many shapes and formats. And it really comes down to how law enforcement communicates best with its community. And we in the Department of Corrections and MSOP really do thank the Rochester Police Department and all of its efforts to ensure that this important information is getting out to the broadest amount of folks as possible so that you can apply it effectively into your family and community safety planning efforts. Next slide, please. So we're going back to that funnel analogy at the narrowest end for those individuals who do cross the threshold of prison and do come out. And 90% of those who are incarcerated will come out at expiration or onto supervised release at some point. I want to share with you the breakdowns of risk levels assigned. Now, year after year, the number of people coming across those thresholds does fluctuate and change. But what tends to stay fairly static is the breakdown of levels assigned. And as you can see, the majority of risk levels assigned are that of levels 1 and 2. On average, 15% of risk levels assigned each year are that of a level 3. And those are the group predominantly that are subject to that broad public notification. Now, obviously, today there'll be some nuance to that, and we'll get into more detail about that. But as you're thinking about your awareness, know that even though we're only able to speak directly to the large group of people about that 15%, that smallest amount, know that the information we're able to provide in these types of conversations can be applied broadly. And that's really what we're seeking here, is to use the information we've attained over the years of knowledge and understanding and research so that you can apply it effectively into those family and community safety planning efforts. Next slide, please. So as kind of a final kind of window down again over that snapshot, if you're interested in those communities that I showed the earlier numbers on, as of the 11th, there were 483 of those registrants that we talked about earlier who are subject to that broad public notification. And you can see the breakdowns again at that time of how they look in and around communities. And every community up there has at least somebody who's subject to that broad notification. But again, you recall that larger number from my earlier slide. And it's so important to know that even though they may not reside within your specific city or area, that you want to still have that broad awareness, because we know that they do go and cross city lines, borders, county lines, whatever the case may be, for all manner of reasons, for work purposes, visiting family and friends, traveling to meet their life needs, such as grocery shopping and resources, treatment, medications, etc. And so again, broad awareness is just so very critical. And you can see here that at the time I looked at this, there were 10 of those 483 who are out of compliance with the registry and need to be brought back into compliance. And again, so it just goes to show that broad awareness is so critical, because you, the community, are a critical part of that state risk management system. Because as you no doubt will contemplate, law enforcement can't be there all the time. And in those interims, in those breaks, they rely on their community partnerships to ensure that everyone's safety is being met and maintained. So hopefully the information we're providing you today helps to enhance your awareness further so that you feel more comfortable in this knowledge and are more able, therefore, to access your law enforcement agency for any help or questions you may have. Next slide, please. Back to that study, another part of that research that we found really spoke to the relationships between those who commit this kind of harm and the people they hurt. And now you'll see that this actual data was pulled from a different study out of the Bureau of Justice and Statistics through the Department of Justice in 2000. But I like to include it in presentations like this so you have some other research data available to you to consider, and it aligns very much with our own statewide data. And what you can see from this information is that the majority of those individuals who are actively engaging in this type of harm have a relationship with the people they hurt. And they utilize that knowing. They utilize that sense of safety and security to exploit it and exploit that access. Whether it's a familial type relationship or just an acquaintanceship where they're in a position of trust with that child or teen. You'll see here from this data that 7% fall into that stranger category. Now, this is obviously the part that gets all of our attention, as it should, because we know as family members, okay, we say, Brad, we get it. We can do a lot within our family networks to ensure that our children are with safe, appropriate, healthy adults who are going to foster them in supportive ways. We can even go further and say that those who get to have acquaintanceships with our children, those who get to be, in positions of authority, those who get to have those positions of trust, we can vet them as parents and trusted adults. And that's very, very true. But that 7%, that stranger group, is the group that gives us pause, because this is a group that's just beyond our control, just outside of our direct influence. And these are the people that in our mind's eye are those lurking just outside of our awareness with ill intent. And so it's worth breaking down a little further just what it is that this research study could and could not do. So to put it in kind of really just basic terms, the analysts, the assessors for this study had to create a cutoff point, and they determined that cutoff point to be 24 hours. And so if they could not, through their review of all the data available on the offense that occurred with those research subjects that they were looking at, if they could not determine that a knowing or a relationship of trust had been formulated within that 24-hour period, they would put them into the stranger category. Now, what this would inevitably mean was that you could have a scenario like this, where two teens meet up at a house party. And they had not previously known each other. Perhaps they went to different schools or were in different grades or something to that effect. And they hit it off, and the night was going the way it was going. And they decided to leave the group to a more secluded area, either within the house or outside of the home, whatever the case may be, and were isolated from the rest of the group. And the night took an awful turn. Now, this offense would fall into that stranger category. But what we tend to think of more when we think of stranger is that person lurking just outside of our awareness, just beyond our scope, who has that ill intent. And that group tends to fall in a much lower percentage category, as about 3%. Now, that's cold comfort, I am well aware. But as you're contemplating today how to best apply this information into those safety plans, please know that to focus all of your energy and resources on that 3% will lead to potentially missing one of the much more likely scenarios that may occur. We want that broad awareness. We want it to be applied throughout those interactions that our children, our teens, and our young children may be having in and throughout their daily lives. Next slide, please. Another piece of information that I want to share with you from this research study, that as you're contemplating those safety plans, is the age breakdown of those harmed. And you can see here from this data set, and this is from that follow-up study to the original one with the DOC. It concluded in 2012, and it followed another additional 2,000 plus known sex offenders into the community for a grand total of over 5,000 sex offenders studied right here in Minnesota. And what you can see here, at least at first blush, is you'll see it's broken into thirds. But very quickly, you'll notice that 2/3 of this group are children. And then you'll look even further and you'll see that the narrowest age range up there, that 13 to 17 years of age, constitutes 33% of those harmed. That's 9% of the population, and it is worth going into some further detail as to what may be going on here. So what we know is from that 0 to 12 age range, the parents and trusted adults are still very much making those decisions as to who the children get to have access to and vetting the people that come and go throughout those children's lives. And so we as agencies throughout the state and local agencies want to make sure that we're providing those parents and loved ones with the best tools and resources available to them. But what we find happens when we get in those teenage years is the very thing that we as communities strive to achieve. And that is a place where our children can safely go out and explore their own autonomy. And this is the very thing that makes them vulnerable, because now they are formulating relationships outside of that watchful gaze of that trusted adult support network. And so what we've found in our collaborations with victim services groups and advocacy groups like the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center is that we've gotten away from that model of the talk, where we pulled our teen aside at that critical age as parents or loved ones and removed the veil just enough to show them that the world is not as safe as it had been made to be for them when they were younger. Now, often we found teens would react in one of two really distinct ways. Either they would rebuke that information, say, no, mom, dad, whatever the case may be, you are overreacting. My friends are safe. Everything's fine. You're wrong. Or on the other side, we'd find the teens would recoil out of fear and start to disengage from their loved activities and from their communities. Neither of those reactions are helpful to our children. And so we grew from that the talk model to a model of a lot of little talks for our children in an age appropriate way all the way through childhood, each compounding on the next, going up along with the child's maturity level and capabilities and knowledge, in order to keep from frightening them with this information, because we know that scared children do not equal safer children. But we as parents and community members also need our kids to understand that nice people do not always equal safe people. And so I will be providing you with some additional resources to utilize and augment in your safety planning efforts with this information that we're sharing with you today. Next slide, please. So I know I've thrown a lot of detail at you and a lot of numbers, and it can be daunting. But I do truly hope that it at least kind of opened the door to some of that broader awareness, and that you can apply it as you learn more about this man that you're here to learn about tonight. But if you take nothing else away from what I've shared with you today, please let it be this: that from the data and research that we've attained over these years, and we have learned a lot from that, we know that 90% of those who have come through that array of that state risk management system do not go on to reoffend in the same or similar fashion. 90% of those who engage in this type of harm, sexual harm, are known to their victim. And they utilize that relationship, that knowing, that trust that they've built to exploit that and manipulate and manage their victims. So it really does come down to the 90% who we have not become aware of yet. 90% of those actively engaging year after year, based on our sentencing statistics, are those who have never been known to the system for sex offense crimes previously. And so again, it just really serves to emphasize that broad awareness is so very critical. We know about the man, or we will know about the man you're here to learn about today, but we want that awareness to be broadened. So it really does come down to that relationship piece. That geographical proximity is so unhelpful because what we know is it really comes down to that social proximity. We know that these individuals can cross city, county lines with daily for work purposes, treatment purposes, and so on. And so really, as you're thinking about applying this into those safety plans, keep that in mind. Now, I'd like to just remind everybody before we transition over that the email for Lieutenant Fudskar is up. And if you are having questions or would like more information and details, please do email that into him and we will address those questions at the end of our presentation. And with that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague with MSOP, Director Nancy Johnston.
Thanks, Brad. Good afternoon. My name is Nancy Johnston. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Sex Offender Program. The next several slides, we're going to cover civil commitment in Minnesota very briefly, the treatment program that we operate, and then more specifically, some information regarding Ben Ellerson, who we're speaking of today. Minnesota is one state of 20 that has chosen to have civil commitment in our state. Other states, the other 30 states actually, choose not to have civil commitment. And when a person is nearing the end of a prison term, they may go right into the community, either supervised or not supervised. But Minnesota has this law in effect, and it has been in effect since 1939. About 15 to 20 people every year are newly civilly committed and come to the program for treatment. Most civilly committed people have served prison time prior to arriving, but we do have some individuals who have never served a prison time. When an individual is nearing his end date, release from prison, the Department of Corrections may choose to refer that person to the county that the client, the individual, comes from. The county, then, the county attorney makes a decision as to whether to pursue civil commitment or not. If the county decides to pursue commitment, there is a trial that's held, commitment takes place, and the individual then is committed indeterminately to the Department of Human Services as a sexually dangerous person, SDP, or a sexual psychopathic personality, SPP. Only the court has the authority to civilly commit people. Next slide, please. So the sex offender program is administered by DHS, by the Department of Human Services, not the Department of Corrections. When clients are civilly committed, their civil rights are restored, they're out of prison, they're with us, and they're with us for treatment. We are a treatment program and we're mandated by law to provide sex offender specific treatment. We have two locations, one in Moose Lake and one in St. Peter. Both locations have two buildings behind a secure perimeter. In St. Peter, we have also a portion of our program. It's a transitional program outside of the perimeter. It is an unlocked, less restrictive residential setting for clients who have been transferred by the courts to reside there and continue their treatment. That is the reintegration portion of our program as clients prepare to move into the community. While people are with us, while clients are with us, they go through 3 phases of treatment if they choose to engage and participate in treatment. It involves core groups, individual therapy, and psychoeducational modules. We also have other programming, which includes health services, therapeutic rec, spiritual and vocational educational services. Next slide, please. When clients are committed to us, they have the right to petition every 6 months after their last case has been resolved. for a reduction in custody, and they petition to the Civil Commitment Appeals Panel, or CAP, which consists of 3 judges. The petitions can be for transfer out of the secure perimeter into community preparation services, I just mentioned a few moments ago, or for a provisional discharge, or for a full discharge. CAP, the 3-judge panel, rules to either grant or deny the petition for one of those reductions. If a provisional discharge is granted, the client is then released into the community after housing is secured, and a comprehensive plan kicks in and very, very close supervision of that individual while he's on provisional discharge. The commissioner of the Department of Human Services can appeal if he or she disagrees with the ruling, can appeal to the Minnesota Court of Appeals or to the Supreme Court of Minnesota, and that does happen on occasion. Next slide, please. So in order for a client to be provisionally discharged, he has to meet these 2 criteria under Minnesota statute. The committed person's course of treatment and present mental status indicate there's no longer a need for treatment and supervision in the current setting, and the conditions of the provisional discharge plan will provide a reasonable degree of protection to the public and will enable the committed person to adjust successfully to the community. So in order for the PD, the provisional discharge, to be granted by the 3-judge panel, the client must meet these 2 criteria. Next slide, please. So now we'll spend a few slides speaking about Benjamin James Ellerson, the client who recently moved to the Rochester community. He is a risk level 1, as Brad described earlier. Next slide, please. His date of birth, he was born in September of 1975, and he's currently 45 years old. He's 5'9", 190 pounds, green eyes, brown hair. The residence that he has moved to is in the 2100 block of Campus Drive, Southeast Rochester. Next slide, please. The offense history of Mr. Ellerson includes, in his early 20s, he did engage in separate acts of sexual contact with 2 teenage females that he knew. He gained and maintained access to the victims over time through attention and affection. In 1998, in Olmsted County, he sexually assaulted a 14-year-old and a 13-year-old female acquaintance. He was charged and convicted of criminal sexual conduct in the 3rd degree. Same year, 1998, also in Olmsted County, sexually assaulted a 13-year-old girl acquaintance, someone he knew again. Criminal sexual conduct, 3rd degree conviction also resulted. Next slide, please. So in May of 1999, he entered prison. In February of 2000, he was released into the community as a level 2 sex offender. 4 years later, in 2004, his release in the community was revoked. He was reassessed and reassigned a level 3. As Brad explained earlier, that number can change based on the circumstances. In February of 2005, his sentence expired, and so he was discharged or released from the Department of Corrections. His county decided to civilly commit him, and he came to MSOP, arrived, and was admitted for treatment. Mr. Ellerson participated in treatment, as you can tell, for several years. In 2016, the court granted his petition to transfer to community preparation services. So Mr. Ellerson lived outside the perimeter in an unlocked facility for the last 4 years, since 2016, without any problems or issues, and he's been successful in that process of reintegration as he prepared for the community. October 6th, he was then granted a provisional discharge from court, and he moved to Rochester February 26th as a level 1 sex offender. Next slide, please. Thank you. So while he's on supervision, MSOP will do that supervision until a court eventually fully discharges Mr. Ellerson from his commitment. Once that happens, the state is no longer responsible for his supervision. He must follow his court-ordered provisional discharge plan, which includes several conditions of supervision. MSOP has the legal authority to return Mr. Ellerson to one of our facilities at any time to address any concerning or suspicious behavior that comes up. It's called a revocation of release. We can also do a 60-day voluntary return where we ask the client to return to a facility in case we need to investigate or explore suspicious behaviors for a period of time and make a decision about whether or not we're going to fully revoke the client. Mr. Ellerson will be subject to registration for the rest of his life. Next slide. The role of the reintegration agent is important. It's very similar to a probation agent within the Department of Corrections. He or she serves as an agent and a case manager both. They manage and supervise no more than 10 clients at any given time, so they have a very small caseload on purpose. They conduct random searches, test for alcohol and drug use, conduct unannounced visits to the client's work and where he lives. They manage the global positioning system, or GPS, which is a bracelet on Mr. Ellerson's ankle, which remains there at all times. We are aware of his location all the time, 24/7. The agent oversees the client's compliance with the court-ordered provisional discharge plan, all of those conditions and rules that he needs to follow. They conduct overt and covert surveillance as needed, and they help the client with job searches, outpatient treatment, and case planning. Next slide, please. Currently, there are 30 clients who are in the community residing on a provisional discharge. We've had a total of 45 clients that have been granted a PD over the years. No MSOP provisionally discharged client has ever sexually reoffended or had any contact with law enforcement up to this point. Since 2016, there have also been 14 clients that have been granted a full court-ordered discharge from civil commitment and either live here in Minnesota or have decided to leave the state. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. The reintegration agent for Mr. Ellerson is Pat Quigley, and this is his contact information. You can call that number at any time if you have any questions. That concludes my portion of the presentation.
All right, thank you. Oh, just getting a big control. That one better. Oh, I see. Nancy, if you'd mute your mic. There we go. All right. So just to kind of round out everything that we've been doing, I want to just leave you with some resources for you to utilize as you go forward and apply all this information that you've received today. Above all and foremost, available to you is your local law enforcement. These individuals have been managing this type of population and caseload for a long time, as you can see from back in the 90s, and are going to be your best and most direct resource. Should you see this man or anyone really, now that your awareness has been broadened, who is engaging in conduct or activity that you feel is questionable or raises the hair on the back of your neck, I want you to be calling 911. As you've seen, there are so many more individuals subject to the registry in and around communities, but as you've seen more, there's even greater number we don't know about. And if you have general questions for just how policing is conducted for the Rochester Police Department with this unique population, certainly contact their non-emergency number and they'll be happy to assist you further. Next slide, please. As for your local victim services provider, I want to make sure you are aware of the Dodge, Fillmore, and Olmsted Counties Victim Services Group. conversations like this, regardless of how hard we try to ensure that we're not creating fear and really bringing people back, is obviously going to be very difficult to do. Statistics being what they are, somebody reviewing this, watching this recording down the road, knowing what we know, the odds are good that somebody watching it has either been directly impacted by this type of harm or has supported somebody who has been impacted by this type of harm. And we want to make sure that if this conversation has upset you, or you know of somebody who may benefit from additional services, that you have this information readily available to you. In addition to your local victim services provider, I'd like to also mention the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. As you're thinking about having those conversations with your families, with your children and loved ones, and augmenting those safety plans, use them as well as a resource to you in having those conversations. Often in meetings like this, a question will come up: Brad, I have a child with developmental disabilities. How do I have this type of conversation with them? And I would turn you to both your local victim services advocates there and the JWRC program, as they are definitely the subject matter experts. Next slide, please. Again, as you're trying to really kind of wrap your head around all this information provided to you, and thank you for bearing with us, don't let this be the only information you receive on this important subject. Here's a snapshot of some other resources that are out there and available to you. Please do check them out and see what they have available as well. Next slide. And for your, lastly, for your state resources, as I talked about earlier, wanting to make sure we're providing those adults and trusted support people and parents with good resources so they can vet the people coming into and creating relationships. One of those resources that are available to you is through the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and that is the criminal history search function. You can go on to that website and type in anybody's first name, last name, and date of birth and get their criminal history. So if you're vetting somebody who wants to be a volunteer coach for your summer soccer league, or or you're considering somebody to be a tutor, or whatever the case may be, this is a great resource, and we do definitely encourage you to utilize that, because as you've seen, not all convicted individuals of registrable offenses are subject to notification. And then lastly, the Department of Corrections has a great deal of resources also available to you as you're trying to collect and gain more information on this topic. We have all the research and data that I've been referencing today available in its original form, not in just convenient PowerPoint slides. I encourage you to check that out, read through it, and definitely draw your own conclusions. We also maintain an offender locator. That's for anybody under the jurisdiction of the DOC. And again, this individual is not under the DOC's jurisdiction. They are with the MSOP program, but just know that that is a resource available to you more broadly. And then ultimately, the public registrant search function, where you will find that this individual will be, while they are subject to broad public notification, even though they're a level 1. And once they are no longer subject to that broad public notification, they will come off of that registrant search. But this is where you will be able to see all that information. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to the Lieutenant and County Attorney Ostrom and wait for some questions.
Thank you, Brad and Nancy, for the presentations. County Attorney Ostrom, would you like to say a couple words?
You guys know me too well, and you know I always enjoy saying something. My name is Mark Ostrom. I'm the Olmsted County Attorney, and I really enjoy having these meetings and being part of these meetings, frankly, because I continue to learn a lot about these. There's a couple things I want to point out, and it's actually really good that we have this recorded and people can go back and listen to it. Brad talked a lot about, in particular, the risk levels. It's extremely confusing, and Brad did a really nice job of explaining it. And I'd encourage people to go back and revisit that and understand the various levels, 1, 2, 3, and what they mean, especially when we think about somebody like Ben Ellerson, who frankly has been at all 3 of those levels at some point. And so understand, the assessment process that gets people whatever level they're assigned, and the fact that In this particular case, Ben has worked himself down to what a risk level of 1. I also was very pleased to listen to Nancy's presentation too about MSOP and the work that they do. I've worked very closely with MSOP over the number of years, and you know, I feel like I know that program really well. And when I see somebody like Ben Ellerson, who has been in MSOP and has worked hard, and has gotten himself to the point where MSOP and the courts have agreed that a provisional discharge is the appropriate release level or security level for Ben, I know that I can feel safe that MSOP has done a lot of great work with Ben, and Ben himself has done a lot of great work to get himself to a safe spot and to come out into our community. Now, that doesn't mean that we all just can relax and take it easy. We want to be vigilant, not only about Ben, but more importantly, about all the folks that surround us. And we always want to be vigilant and keep ourselves safe. But I feel very comfortable knowing the program at MSOP, knowing the work that Nancy and her staff have done, and in particular, knowing the hard work that Ben had to do to get to this point, that I think we can have a level of comfort knowing that Nancy and her staff, Pat Quigley, the folks that are going to be working with Ben are going to do their level best, and Ben is going to do his best to be safe in our community and for our community to be safe. So, you know, I could go on and talk about this stuff forever. I certainly would stand for questions, and I certainly would open it up. I think I'm one of the more easy people to find in this community. If after the presentation, if you watch it later, if you have questions for me, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to respond to those questions as well. Tom, did you get any questions out there?
We have not had any questions submitted yet. But I would like to encourage anybody, just like you said, County Attorney Ostrom, to even if you're watching the recorded version of this and a question comes up or you go back and review it, like was said earlier, there's a lot of information that was presented tonight. Those were 2 excellent presentations. Feel free to send me an email. I will direct it to the correct person or answer it myself if I can. So with that, I would just like to say thank you again to everybody who joined us today, and to the presenters. Thank you again for helping us out with this, and we can go ahead and conclude the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.